Hello and welcome to the Sociology of Sexualities, Sociology 3U03 at McMaster University. I'm Dr. Tina Fetner. This is Module 4, Gender and Sexuality. Today we're going to talk a little bit about sex and gender as two concepts that are related but don't mean the same thing. Right? If you may have heard by now as a sociology major in your third year of university, that sex is biological and gender is social. Right? When we refer to sex as physiological differences between female and male bodies, we're talking about characteristics that distinguish the female, the sort of sex between people, female on the one hand or male on the other hand. The way that people do this is through a series of evidence, right? There isn't one specific thing that names a body as female or male. It's a combination of things. Chromosomes, the way that your external genitalia appears on the surface, the way that your internal reproductive organs are formed, and your hormone levels. Right, we like to pretend that there is two very different bodies, one of which has an XX chromosome, vulva and a vagina and a clitoris, and uterus and ovaries, and hormone levels that have more estrogen than testosterone. And the other body is the opposite, right? XY chromosomes, penis and testicles, and hormone levels that have higher levels on average of testosterone than estrogen, right? But in reality, among humans, like among many, many species, there is actually a range of body types that is as opposed to two opposites, right? The idea of an opposite sex is a myth. There's plenty of bodies between this. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about sex. When we talk about gender, this is a sociological term that talks about social relations, right? So this is a word that we mean to categorize all of the social expectations of women and men that distinguish, for example, masculinity from femininity. So behaviors in the social world, preferences, for example, characteristics. We have a whole understanding about gender, women being feminine and men being masculine. And just like for the category of sex, there really aren't two opposites, but really a range of behaviors. Now, I want to challenge this initial kind of thing that sociologists often say, that sex is biological and gender is social, because in reality, both gender and sex are both biological and social, right? So, in fact, you see a case like, for example, intersex infants. Now, these are babies that are born with some kind of a gender presentation, or I should say, sex presentation that is somewhere between totally aligned with femaleness or totally aligned with maleness. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. Some are medical conditions and some are just kind of natural variation. But when this occurs, the process of understanding what kind of body this infant has is a highly social one. It's governed by the social norms of the day. It's governed by a system of understanding both sex and gender. And it's governed by an understanding of, what is life going to be like for somebody that is in between these two categories. And one of the things that intersex activists have been arguing for now decades is that, the best path is to just understand that bodies have a wide variety of presentations of sex and just sort of change our categories of sex to understand that, or broaden out what counts as a male body or a female body, create a different category that is an intersex sexuality. But in practice, many times doctors and parents want to shape the bodies to conform to the sex categories that we have, male and female. And they'll do this by sort of just deciding what sex the infant should be, and then using surgery to change the body to match the category of sex. So this is harmful, right? A lot of times the surgeries are painful and cause problems. A lot of times the scar tissues interrupt people's capacity for sexual pleasure and orgasm. And there's a great concern in the intersex community that, there's these surgeries are happening without the consent of the individual that's undergoing the surgery, because they are too young to consent. This is happening when babies are first born, oftentimes, or throughout people's childhood. But in terms of this lesson that we're talking about, the difference between sex and gender, this is a good understanding of sex isn't totally clear, right? And the process that we use to clarify that is a social process, right? That involves power and decision making, and that involves acting on bodies without one's consent. So sex is social in addition to being biological. And I think the more controversial claim is that gender, which everyone agrees is social, right? Socially produced are expectations for men and women. We've seen these kinds of cultural expectations change over time, so we understand them to be different in one cultural context from another cultural context. But I would argue that, of course, these kinds of our understandings of gender are built on top of our observations of people's biology and our experiences of our own bodies, and biological forces are really relevant to the way that gender expectations are produced. And so I would say there's a biological component to gender as well. One of the ways that we understand sexuality is through a gender lens, right? So I want to talk a little bit about accomplishing sexuality as a gender performance, and how sex and sexuality and gender are all kind of tangled up together, at least in our cultural context. Right? So if you think about the understandings of how we express our heterosexual identities to the people around us, right? For those of us who are heterosexual, if we wanted to characterize the kinds of behaviors that people undertake to express a heterosexual identity, most of these involve gender performances, right? So we understand that people's attraction to other sex are expressed through their conformity to more traditional gender presentations, right? And we get on the flip side, we think that we understand social clues about a lesbian identity or a gay identity as violations of those gender norms, right? So stereotypes about homosexuality are linked to gender violations, right? Conforming to gender expectations completely, right? Understanding if you are a woman, that your behavior should be 100% girly or feminine, that if you're a man, you should be 100% manly or macho. This also requires you to not express any homosexual tendencies, right? So it requires to live up to your social expectations for femininity or masculinity. You'll have to be attracted to people from the other gender. Right? And so this goes both ways. Gender is constructed through expressions of sexuality, and your sexuality is constructed through expressions of gender. And following gender rules or social norms requires sexuality-related rules and norms as well. So this understanding of sexuality and gender is related to an important sociological concept that I wanted to talk with you about: social institutions, right? So if this kind of understanding of sexuality and gender being kind of entangled together and being part of your performance of who you are to express both your sexuality and gender identities, you're really seeing these two things as intersecting social institutions. Right, so I want to define for you what a social institution is. I have a very simple definition. Sometimes you'll hear in sociology more complex definitions than this, but I think a simple one is useful for us today. Right, I define a social institution as a set of rules that governs the behavior of large groups of people. Right, so other social institutions that you might think of include marriage, the family, race, education, right? In social institutions, sometimes the first thing that pops into your mind is like a building, like a school. That's a social institution. And it is. It's a set of rules for governing the behavior of large groups of people. We organize people in schools into age-graded classrooms, and we give them rituals to tell them how to perform. It's a set of rules that governs our behavior. Tells us what to learn at what point in time in our lives, etc. Right? But just as something like education that's associated with like a building is an institution, so are more abstract concepts like gender and sexuality. If you think about gender as a social institution, it also can be seen as a set of rules governing the behavior of large groups of people. Right? The rules tell us how, as a woman, we should sit, how we should fix our hair, how we should talk, what kind of food we should like, what kind of movies we should care for, and the same goes for men's as well. A social institution lens helps us see the social expectations that govern our lives. But once again, I always want to point out that this is just because that sociologists can identify social expectations and we can see that these social norms do shape people's behaviors, they don't determine people's behaviors, right? They influence people's behaviors. And so it isn't totally possible that if you're aware of a gender norm, right, you can violate it. And that's possible and you can do that. But according to this theoretical lens, there will be social consequences if you do. And so you have to be willing to endure those social consequences to break a gender norm or a sexual norm. The same goes for heterosexuality. It also can be seen as a social institution, right? So we can see heterosexuality as a set of desires, right, that's targeted toward an opposite gender or an other gender person or set of people. We can see it as an identity that you take on as a straight person, right? And we see it as a disposition, a characteristic, a set of personality traits, for example. But if we look at heterosexuality as a social institution, we need to observe a set of rules to follow. And I think that the exercise that you already did to build the hierarchy of sexuality really primed you for seeing heterosexuality as a set of rules to follow, right? If you find a lifelong partner, if you get married to that partner, if you have children and stay married, then the social world around you probably will give you a lot of positive rewards and feedback. And if you violate those sexual rules of the social institution of heterosexuality, there may be social consequences ranging from mild to severe, right? So this concept of social institution, once again, theoretical lens that you can put on to bring some aspects of reality into focus. And I think it's a particularly useful one for understanding gender and sexuality. Right, I want to look at gender and heterosexuality in particular as mutually constituting social institutions. Right, so they constitute each other, they reinforce each other. They're two institutions that work together. Right, so they're two sets of rules that work together. To what extent do they rely on inequalities between men and women and between straight and gay people? Right, so it's not just that there are rules enforcing our behavior, but they're also rules that are producing our social reality, right, constitutive of our social reality, and both relying on and creating social inequalities of gender and sexuality. I think it's useful to think of gender and heterosexuality as two sets of mutually reinforcing rules. But recently, we've seen these rules go through substantial social change, right? So what happens when the rules change? What happens when the restrictions on women's behaviors, for example, are lifted and women are kind of given social permission to do a wider range of activity, like work and raise a family? What happens then? Does the gender regime collapse? Does patriarchy fold in upon itself? Similarly, what happens when the rules around heterosexuality soften or change, right? Does our strong understanding of heterosexuality as normal and right and good and the center of our social fabric, does that idea recede? Does it collapse? Do we suddenly find a situation where straight and gay people are equal? Do we find ourselves in a situation where women and men are equal? I'm just going to leave those questions there for you to ask. Obviously, I have my own opinion on it. I want to talk now to move to the next topic in our class, which is gender identity. Right, so gender identity refers to the relationship between one's sex and one's gender, right? Within the individual, the sort of match or mismatch of the sex assigned at birth, right? And one's understanding of the self as a gendered being, right? I want to talk about how gender identity categories have been emerging recently. But it's very important for us to understand that the people experiencing a mismatch between the sex they were assigned at birth and the gender that they live in their lives as adults is not a new phenomenon at all. There have been a lot of people that have been violating gender expectations for centuries. There have been people who've passed as the other sex. There have been women who moved to a new town, lived as a man and got married to a woman. There have been similarly men who have passed as women, and there have been all kinds of people living sort of lives that are outside these restrictive gender norms that I've been talking about so far. So despite people breaking these gender norms, of course, heteronormativity has persisted, gender and gender inequality has persisted, but are things changing recently? Recently, we've seen a lot of social change recognizing transgender people as worthy of human rights, as equal to cisgender people, and a lot more attention has been brought to concerns of inequalities and mistreatment of transgender people. One of the things that's changed recently is the emergence of new gender identities that are a range of ways that people express their gender to help people make sense of who they are and where they fit in a gender schema. Sociologist Laurel Westbrook looks at the emergence of a trans identity that is born out of a set of other terms that are similar that activists push forward into our discourse, and that then other activists critiqued and debated and decided was sort of not quite right. Right? So identities that started out as pathologies that were defined by the sexologists that we discussed in last week's module, like transsexual, right, was the starting place for claiming trans identity among trans activists. And this wasn't seen as sufficient to describe the range of gendered experiences. So transgender became an alternate term that some people preferred to capture all the different ways that people express transsexual and transgender identities. Sort of trans asterisk identity emerged to try to be an umbrella term that covered a lot of different experiences. But then the asterisk was dropped, and today the most common way that people express an identity where the gender that they live is different from the sex they were assigned at birth is just trans, right, with no ending, although you also will see transgender here and there. Other formulations of trans identities that you might see include trans people or trans folks, right? And people who experience their trans identities as a transition might call themselves a trans man or a trans woman. We've also seen the emergence of the category, the sort of unmarked category of people whose gender identity matched the sex that they were assigned at birth, so not transgender. This is called cisgender or cis, and this identity emerged later, right, to make trans not the only way to talk about gender identity, right, and to distinguish cisgender experiences from transgender experiences. And I want to emphasize that even though Westbrook identifies trans identities as sort of emerging over time and somewhat recently emerged, trans people are not new, right? So trans identities are not new because all of a sudden people are just now starting to cross gender boundaries. They're not new ideas, right? But they're new ways of expressing those ideas. They're new ways to make meaning around gender identity. These identities emerge through activists and conversations with publics, right? And so lots of ideas are put forward. Some catch on, others are set beside, and then not everyone agrees on what the right category, what the right identity category is. And this is a very special moment in sort of sociology, to look at the negotiation and to look at the social processes through which identities that used to be something that we didn't really talk about are debated and discussed. Right? And so this is still ongoing, right? And so trans may not be the identity category that we land on permanently. Other competing identities exist in the gender identity spectrum. Some people go by gender non-binary, other people are agender, and some folks with those identities adopt the identity of trans and others do not. Right? Other people experience a transition and then leave a trans identity behind. Right? Other people embrace it. One of the things that sociologists are especially concerned with is not just how we talk about these identities and how new understandings of gender are sort of created, but how they become institutionalized, right? And so this is something that is especially important to social change, right? Because we can debate and talk about ideas, but they really become etched in stone when, for example, the Canadian government decides that passports can have a non-male, non-female gender category, right? And so recently Canada joined the countries that allowed an X identity in a passport for a non-male, non-female gender identity. Similarly, birth certificates are also allowing a non-binary gender category in some places, but it's important to note that in Canada, birth certificates are produced at the province level, and so there is still some variation across the country in how birth certificates, whether they've institutionalized trans identities. Okay, that's all we have for this week. Moving forward, I want you to complete all the readings for Module 4. Take a look, read deeply. It's all very interesting, and it goes into some of these issues in a lot more depth than I'm able to here in this lecture. And then once you've done that, you're really going to be in a great position to ace the weekly quiz and complete that by the deadline. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.